الرحمن الرحيم يا أيها الذين آمنوا اتقوا الله وذروا ما بقي من الربا إن كنتم مؤمنين.
ای کسانی که ایمان آورده اید، از مخالفت فرمان خدا بپرهیزید و آنچه از مطالبات ربا باقی مانده رها کنید اگر ایمان دارید.
فإن لم تفعلوا فأذنوا بحرب من الله ورسوله وإن تبتم فلكم رؤوس أموالكم لا تظلمون ولا تظلمون.
اگر چنین نمی کنید بدانید خدا و رسولش با شما پیکار خواهند کرد و اگر توبه کنید سرمایه های شما از آن شماست، اصل سرمایه بدون سود، نه ستم می کنید و نه بر شما ستم وارد می شود.
صدق الله العلی العظیم.
انجمن مالی اسلامی ایران.
Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. My Lord, uplift my heart for me and make my task easy, and remove the impediment from my tongue so people may understand my speech. Ramadan Mubarak. Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to the international webinar on development of Islamic finance markets in a multipolar world. I'm Ali Reza Kamandi, Secretary of International Affairs at the Iranian Association of Islamic Finance. Today we have the pleasure of having Professor Dr. Sualfi, Senior Researcher at ISRA from Malaysia. We have the pleasure of having Dr. Jonathan Erkenbrak, Chair Center for Islamic and Middle Eastern Law at Swansea University of London from England. Last but not least, we have the pleasure of having Dr. Iram Sabu, Professor of Islamic Finance Banking, Institute of Business Administration, Karachi, from Pakistan. And at first I need to say, and if the attendees have any questions, the questions will be answered after the end of each speaker's presentation. And or you can raise your hand. You can see there are some icons on the top right hand of the screen, and if you raise your hand, you can ask the question, or you can type the questions. I'm not going to speak too much because our presenters are highly prepared, and without wasting the time, let's go to the first presenter, Professor Dr. Sualfi. The floor is yours. Thank you. Dr. Sualfi, please turn on your camera to start it.
Can you hear me?
Yes, thank you. Start.
Okay. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi ta'ala wa barakatuh.
Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullah.
Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. Alhamdulillah rabbil alameen. Wa salatu wa salamu ala rasulillahi nabi al-amin. Brother Sulaiman, the International Association of Islamic Finance in Iran, all the members, respected scholars, experts, Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi ta'ala wa barakatuh. It gives me great pleasure to be one of the speakers in this forum, in this international forum that is discussing one of the main topics that concerns Islamic finance and the development of the Islamic markets, especially at a juncture of history where the world is witnessing some kind of multipolarity. The topic or the theme of this forum is a very successful one, as we have to set the direction of Islamic finance in this turning point, the point where the world is going multipolar. Brother Sulaiman, I would like to share my slides.
Wait, please, Dr. Swalhi.
Okay. It's sorry. Can you see the slides? I think they are not uploading. Can you see them? No, you cannot see them.
I can't see you. I'm fine, but let me handle it for you.
Yeah. If you have them, can you project them from your side? I think they are not uploading from my side, from my end here. Yeah, exactly. Okay. Thank you very much. All right. I have how many minutes, Brother Sulaiman, just to control my time?
About 20 minutes.
Sorry?
20 minutes.
20 minutes. Okay, good. So as I said in my presentation or in my introduction, Islamic finance is trying to position itself in this multipolar world. Very successful choice of the theme, as we need to know where we are going, what is our position, what are our strengths, what are our weaknesses as we are moving into a multipolar world. But what does that signify in the first place? I'm going to take you through a few slides just to understand this multipolar world, characteristics, features, and based on that, we understand whether Islamic finance can position itself, whether to build new markets or to maintain its own market. So we are here in a situation where we need to develop a new strategy for Islamic finance so that we maintain the status quo of Islamic finance strength, and also to position itself in this new world, the world of multipolarity. Next. What are the key economic features of multipolarity? Next one. There are a few features that we can think about when we talk about a multipolar world. So a multipolar world is defined as a state in which a country's legitimate interests are respected, and developing countries can influence international development. So this is a new framework that would enable the emergence, the involvement of new markets that will have an influence on the existing powers. So these are new powers coming mainly from developing countries, emerging markets. They're trying to influence the superpowers. So we are moving from a unipolar world to a multipolar world. So what does that signify? So this is the first significance. The next step, the next slide. We also, in the next slide, maybe you can go to the next slide, yes. This has to be linked to what has been going on in the last 2 years. In the last 2 years, basically, we have geopolitical tensions coupled with COVID-19 pandemic. These two important factors have contributed to deglobalization, setting the scene for a broader world order, which is actually multipolarity. This is not something that was born actually just a few years ago or when COVID-19 came. Actually, it has been going on for decades, where the world was trying to create new powers, not only politically, but actually economically as well. We all know that now that there is the globalization that has seen the cementing of few powers such as the United States, Europe, as superpowers, and America, of course, has been as a superpower economically, taken control of the world supply chain, the world what we call the dominance of the US dollar, plus the dominance of the technology that has been for decades, that has helped the globalization in a way that is still maintaining the superiority of certain powers at the expense of developing and emerging markets. Therefore, we can perceive multipolarity as a deglobalization process. So from globalization to deglobalization. This thing that is happening around the world, that is moving from globalization to deglobalization, has a number of impact. The next slide will show some of this impact or some of these features. I mean, let's talk first about the features, the characteristics of deglobalization that has given birth to multipolarity. Then we go to see the impact of that on the global market before we go to see the impact on Islamic finance and what should Islamic finance do to protect itself, or let's say to take advantage of this multipolar world, and in the same time how to develop itself. Next slide. In a multipolar world is already driving changes. There are changes already. One of these changes is the correlation for industrial production cycles. The industrial production cycles are being correlated. Secondly, global commodity prices is being affected because, as I said, when it comes to supply chain, it was controlled by certain powers. Now with the multipolar world, this will affect the global commodity prices. But it doesn't mean that it will always go up or down. It depends on how the prices of international commodities will be affected by this new framework, the framework of multipolarity. Deep studies have been conducted on this, and we can say that there are advantages and disadvantages when it comes to the global commodity prices. The next point is the bond and equity market returns. It will affect. There are changes in the bond and equity market returns as the deglobalization would mean that markets have to serve new objectives and have to develop new instruments for the trading of the bonds, trading of these securities, the equities, for example, whereby the inflow. When we talk about globalization, you have some kind of centrality, some kind of dominance, manipulation, monopoly. In a multipolar world, you will see this decentralization, deglobalization, which is the opposite, and you will see the inflow or outflow of funds from first world country to third world country will be also affected because it has already been like the third world is a good buyer of the first world's products, and the first world is a good buyer of third world product, especially resources, not the product, the resources such as oil and petrol. It has been a scenario where this inflow and outflow of funds from Middle East to Europe and America has always been a kind of enriching the rich and impoverishing the poor. So this status quo has been going on, whereby the third world and the emerging market are always seen as serving the first markets or the first world markets. That's why this cycle has not been broken for many decades. The multipolar world will affect the inflow and outflow of funds that are moving across countries. So we may see what we call an emergence of new economies. Developing countries will be no more attached and connected to the superpowers' dominance as we are moving into new regional powers or even nation states powers that have their own economic strength. We already have that strength, but in a multipolar framework, we will see more creation of new assets, cross-border transactions, and of course, we will also see differences, or let's say some variation in the payment system, as I'm going to highlight later. But these are the three major changes that we can expect in a multipolar world, where prices for global commodities prices will be affected. The markets, the financial markets, where bonds and securities and equities will be traded, we may see a high volume of tradability among the new powers that are trying to, what we call, to emerge as a new powers. And therefore, there are pros and there are cons. The next slide. This will be, when we go micro, what we have been talking is like macro perspective. Now, at the micro level, this multipolarity tends to favor companies and sectors whose supply chains are not globally complex and whose products and services do not pose a threat to economic or national security. So when it comes to companies, multipolarity will benefit in case their supply chain is not complex. In other words, it's not very much tied to the existing powers. So, but if you have a company whose supply chain is already tied, so multipolarity means the brick of this supply chain, and therefore it will have negative impact on the local economy. But multipolarity will serve certain companies who have a flexible supply chain framework. We will project this into Islamic banks later, to Islamic financial products, to what extent we can come up with a flexible supply chain for the Islamic financial institutions and for the Islamic markets. The next slide. In the next slide, we will see. So as in a multipolar world, we will have certain aspects, such as we have more intra-trade between emerging and developing countries. So the volume of trade among emerging and developing countries will increase. We will expect, or we will see, a rise of regional developments and investment banks, such as the Asian Infrastructure and Investment Bank. So this regional banks, such as the Asian Bank and the Asian Investment Bank, will be a new feature of a multipolar world. And the financial market trends are becoming more resilient. Why? Because they are designing their strategies, the risk management, more on local, let's say, on regional risks. In other words, the systemic risk that exists in the globalization framework or philosophy. In the globalization philosophy or scenario, the systemic risk is very high. So what happens in the USA may affect the market in England. It may affect the market in Southeast Asia. Simply because when it comes to markets, many securities which are being packaged, for example, like mortgages in the USA, if they are being sold and traded in regional markets such as Luxembourg or Hong Kong, where investors from the Middle East will buy those mortgages. So if these mortgages are not, or if the securities, which may be mortgages, are not performing, so this will affect also Middle Eastern investors who have bought these mortgages. And this is exactly what happened in the 2008 subprime crisis, where this subprime, these mortgages who have been packaged and sold in the market, the value of this mortgage has gone very, very down. And therefore, those who have purchased those securities found themselves in a very awkward situation because they have to sell them at a low price. And that has caused even crash of certain banks in the Middle East. We don't say crash, but they have been badly affected. But individual investors have been badly affected. So multipolarity will actually create a new scenario where this systemic risk will be highly mitigated, if not eradicated. So this is what you can expect. Next slide. There will be increasing rivalry between the US and China in one of the most visible drivers. Next slide. I'm just want to focus on the next point. In the next slide, we will see the effects of multipolarity. What are the effects of multipolarity? Next slide. Multipolarity may lead to leadership vacuum that fuels geopolitical instability in the years to come. So, because you used to have one power or two powers, now you will have many powers. This may lead to a vacuum that may have some economic impact. Second, it may exacerbate global governance challenges. There could be some global governance challenges. For example, when it comes to transparency, disclosure. Now we are bound actually by international standards. We are bound, for example, the Basel III, Basel II, and other, the IFRS on the accounting. Will this be affected when we are talking about a multipolar world, whereby this new scenario will also mean new standards, new practices, new governance practices? So there is also a possibility that these global governance practices may also be affected. Also, we may have an undesirable consequences for the long-term development of systematically important sectors such as energy, financial services, and healthcare. So this is actually the systemic risk, especially in certain sectors such as energy, financial services, and healthcare. I think the war between Russia and Ukraine has already given us a good lesson that in a global world, systemic risk is very clear. So what's happening there is affecting our food prices, and is going to cause an international food crisis, because many of the countries used to import certain commodities from Russia and Ukraine. Now the war not only has cut the supply, but it has increased the price of not only those commodities, but most of the commodities. These are all the effects of a globalized world where systemic risk is very imminent. So in a multipolar, we are expecting less of this effect. Therefore, we need to develop a risk mitigating process, or let's say a mitigation framework for this, I would say, cross-border risks. Next slide. When it comes to companies, industries, and sectors that have globally integrated supply chains, especially those with technology and health security liabilities, could be increasingly vulnerable to multipolar trade and national or economic security policy trends. So companies may be affected, especially with supply chains. Now, let me go to the Islamic finance implication, or the implication of all this on the Islamic finance. The next slide will show that. Yeah, Islamic finance or market, Islamic finance generally positioning itself in a multipolar world. Next slide. What we need to do, I'll just go straight to the measures that we have to take vis-a-vis the impact of multipolar or multipolarity. What we need to do, we need to deglobalize the OIC economies. We are in need of going beyond globalization, but in a very careful way, for the Islamic countries. So we have 52 or 54 Islamic countries. So we need to really go into this deglobalization process. Next. What we need to do for Islamic finance to flourish and position itself in a multipolar world is the internationalization of valuable Islamic finance models of financing and funds raising, which means it's an opportunity for Islamic finance market products to go international. Why? Because emerging markets, developing countries, Islamic finance is being developed mostly in developing countries. So in a multipolar world, if there is an emerging market or a developing country, which is also championing Islamic finance, so it's an opportunity to go global with the new strategies, with the new instruments. Next. What we need to do for Islamic markets is to focus on sustainability and value-based intermediation within Maqasid al-Sharia al-Islamiyya. It's a totally new approach, not totally, but mostly new approach to go sustainable, but within the Maqasid al-Sharia, the objectives of Sharia, so that we present to the world our model of sustainability, which is, on the one hand, very much close to the SDGs, the ESG, and the SRI, this framework that champion the same causes as the Islamic perspective, as the Islamic Maqasid Sharia. But we need to present to the world now, in a multipolar era, our model of Maqasid, of Islamic finance, which is based on Maqasid Sharia. It's a golden opportunity indeed. Next, what we need to do to position ourselves in Islamic finance in a multipolar world is to focus more on asset-backed sukuk, on the risk sharing, and also we need to focus on the Islamization of the financial infrastructure. So when I say asset-backed, this is in contrast with asset-based sukuk. So the asset-backed deal with real assets where you have clear transfer of ownership, liability, and you have assets that are being actually traded. Also, what we need is to reactivate actually the risk-sharing products and framework. And finally, we need to really to Islamize the financial infrastructure that would involve the institutions, the supporting institutions, the standard setting institutions. So we are in need actually to go and present our model on that. Next, what to do to position Islamic finance into a multipolar world is to bridge the gap between the ideals of Islamic finance and its reality. I think 40 years of Islamic finance development has resulted in a conception that on the whole Islamic finance is performing well, but there are many ideals that have yet to be practiced. They have yet to be realized on the ground. So, for example, dealing with the real economy, the issue of justice and fairness between the Islamic bank and the client, the Islamic social finance, the role that Islamic institutions have to play for the undeserved and the unserved segments of a society, we are yet to see good results in that. So in a multipolar world, we can present models for that, because we will be like cooperating among ourselves and using our own resources locally and regionally, so that we will not we will create our own market demand. Next, these are all measures for Islamic finance to take to position itself in a multipolar world. Another thing is the enhancement of the cross-border sukuk issuance among the emerging markets and the developing countries. This is a golden opportunity for Islamic markets to invest in cross-border sukuk. Next, what to do next also is, next slide. Islamic finance must, before that, can you go back? Yeah, Islamic finance has to target clients with less complex global supply chain. As I said before, the global supply chain in a multipolar world will, or maybe I would say, disrupted and affected. So Islamic finance has to target clients with less, well, let's say, flexible supply chains, so that they will not be interrupted, especially in the certain products that use import and export products. Now, if you talk, if an Islamic market, let's say in the Middle East, was doing business in the East, because of some geopolitical conflicts, this supply chain will be disrupted, and therefore we cannot do certain products. We cannot apply certain Islamic financial products, especially on the export and import, cross-border issuances, and so on. Next, what Islamic finance has to do to position itself in a multipolar world is to think and propose to back its local currencies with gold for regional and international trade settlement. Probably what is happening these days has also resulted in, or let's say, has reinvented the wheel again, and has brought to the surface the discussion on gold. Because what is happening these days, this Cold War between certain countries, has also convinced the conflicting parties about the importance of gold. I mean, I have just read an article, even though this must be verified, that there is a proposal by Russia to, beside the adoption of the ruble, the local currency for international settlement, international payment, they are also proposing gold, or the what we call the ruble currency, to be tied with gold, and that would mean the currency would be backed by gold again, going back to the old age when to the few decades ago when the dollar was backed by gold. That has granted a lot of stability to the USD. Now, if emerging markets, especially Muslim markets, developing countries, which are mainly Muslims actually, if they can succeed to have a gold-backed currency for international trade among themselves, regionally, I think that will position Islamic finance in a better way, because number one, we will have an intrinsic a currency that has an intrinsic value because it's backed by gold, and second, we will be dealing with the real economy, because it will reflect the true value for money, because money is supposed to be something that should have its intrinsic value. So in a multipolar world, we need to explore the possibility of introducing a gold-backed currency for international settlements at least. Now, whether cryptocurrency can play that role, a gold-backed cryptocurrency for international trade, whether that will help Islamic finance, I think this is one of the hot issues that is still being debated by Sharia scholars and by central bankers, whether they should introduce it as a legal tender or it is just a financial assets that can be traded in the exchanges, which is happening already now. But whether, I mean, the multipolar world that is trying to divorce itself from the USD dominance, from the dollar. So how can a currency, whether it is a local currency that should be backed by gold or a cryptocurrency that should be backed by gold, to what extent that can strengthen the resilience of the Islamic markets nowadays? It's a matter of, it's an area of research that has to be done, and is a policy issue that developing countries have to take in one way or the other. Next one, and this is the last and before the last. What Islamic finance has to do is to establish more regional and international banks among OIC countries. We already have the IDB, we have the Islamic Asian Bank, but in a multipolar world, we need more regional Islamic banks or even Islamic financial institutions. Next. What we need actually, and this is something that has to be really looked at, the reform of the International Monetary Fund governance to increase the quota allotted to developing countries. So in a multipolar world, more representation of developing countries should be in these international banks, such as the World Bank and the IMF. Next. And this is what we finally need. We need to end all geopolitical conflicts and wars, because it's affecting everybody. Whether you are living within globalization or deglobalization, any conflict in the world is affecting everyone. Next. This will be like a summary that Islamic finance in a multipolar world has the potential to present actually effective models, and we are in need actually to work regionally with the Islamic markets, have to form some kind of alliances so that they can prove themselves viable and relevant to the multipolar world. So what has not been achieved, or what could not have been achieved during the globalization, can be achieved in a multipolar world for Islamic finance, of course. Thank you very much. Wassalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi ta'ala wa barakatuh.
Okay, thank you. It was really informative presentation that you had, and we enjoyed. Thank you. And Dr. Somhi at first defined the multipolar world, and he said, according to his definition, in a multipolar world, every country's legitimate interest is respected, and a multipolar world is driving some changes in correlation for industrial production cycles, global commodity prices, and bond and equity market returns. Also, he said that multipolar world may exacerbate global governance challenges, and in some part of his presentation, he focused on internationalization of viable Islamic finance models of finance and fundraising, and also about the Islamization of the financial infrastructure. And finally, he said that about somehow a kind of a criticism about the forms of international monetary fund, IMF governance to increase the quota allotted to the countries. Thank you, Dr. Swalhi. Nice, and it was really productive. And if the attendees have any questions, can raise the questions. Doctor, our presenter is ready to answer your question. Okay, apparently, our attendees could get, every aspect of your presentation. Thank you, and please be with us till the end of the session, Dr. Swalhi. And now let's go to the second presenter, Dr. Jonathan Erkenbrach. Dr. Jonathan Erkenbrach, floor is yours.
Thank you. Let me just turn on my camera there. Assalamu alaikum and Ramadan Kareem. It's a pleasure to be with you. And I'm so thankful for the kind invitation from the Iranian Association for Islamic Finance. I really enjoy the opportunity to reach out and to speak with you across the world about Islamic finance in a multipolar world, which has been very ably spoken about by Professor Swalhi, who he set the context very well, I think, and made things very easy for me. I'm very fortunate. My work generally is of a legal nature. When we think of multipolarity, Professor Swalhi, I think, underlined quite clearly that what we're talking about there is primarily a political analysis, one which involves power relations and the structures of power. I'd like to talk to you today about a slightly different focus, and that's one that has to do with the very mission of Islamic finance. And I take this analysis from work I've done in concert with my partners, academic partners, at the Hamad bin Khalifa University in Doha, Qatar, and as well at the Islamic Sharia Research Academy, ISRA, where Professor Swalhi is based. And we host an annual workshop in which Sharia scholars, lawyers, regulators, economists, and bankers come together and provide their insights on the industry. And what I'm sharing with you today derives from those insights, and a subsequent report, in fact, will be issued, which goes into greater depth on the ideas that I'm going to present to you today. And that report, I hope, will be issued within the next month or so. So what I call the identity issue is ultimately the challenge of the industry setting itself apart from conventional finance. And this is very, very important because it goes to the very heart of the value proposition that Islamic finance presents. Despite the Islamic ethos of Islamic financial products and services, it's widely agreed that the substantive essence of those products and services is commensurate with the conventional equivalent, meaning you're really dealing economically with the same products despite their difference in legal structure. Now, this is problematic for many reasons. It inhibits the development of the market. It focuses merely that the market that becomes available to Islamic finance is what may be termed a captured market of Islamic fans, Islamic devotees, and devout Muslims who believe, in fact, in the products themselves. But it doesn't widen it up to a larger mission to those people who are skeptical about the industry. It doesn't impact beyond that captive audience, and arguably it undermines the social mission that has always been ultimately at the fore of the Islamic finance movement, if you will. The very theory behind the Islamic economy has been a social mission, and that is something that has not been delivered. Well, Professor Swalhi mentioned that the SDGs, the so-called Sustainable Development Goals that were agreed by the United Nations, and which ultimately are commensurate with the environmental and social goals. There are a lot of different acronyms. Let's just talk about SDGs to keep it simple. They've brought this issue to a head. And ultimately, what the SDGs require of us is, in very general terms, because there are 17 goals and over 100 specific goals attached to those 17 principles. They're generally based on ending poverty, protecting the planet, and ensuring prosperity. Well, these goals, they sound fairly simple, but they're not, and they require a good deal of money. It's estimated that $3 trillion has been found already. That's a lot of money, but that we need, in fact, $2 to $4 trillion a year between now and 2030. Let me move to the next slide. Well, everyone agrees, including the international financial institutions, the IMF, the World Bank, the United Nations, and all sorts of non-governmental organizations across the globe, agree that Islamic finance can be an important contributor to the SDGs. But I want to talk about basically how this relates to Islamic finance, and again, that value proposition that I mentioned previously. First, let's talk about the problem, because every research has to have a research problem. So let's start with that. Well, these significant development issues, some of the most fundamental relating to the SDGs, profoundly affect Muslims and Muslim-majority countries. 40% of the world's poor who live on less than $1.25 a day or less, live in Organization of Islamic Conference states. Humanitarian disaster related to natural catastrophes, as well as conflict, also affects OIC states disproportionately. 30 of 50 conflicts in 2015 affected those OIC states. More than 68.5 million people worldwide have been forcibly displaced, with just 5 countries bearing the burden, all of them Muslim majority. And these displaced persons account for 68% of all refugees under the UNHCR mandate. That represents 71% of people worldwide who actually require humanitarian assistance reside in these OIC countries. So there's a really important moral prerogative for not only Muslim majority states to take the SDGs very seriously and to implement those goals, but also for Islamic finance to mobilize private finance in an Islamically acceptable way. And there is a great deal of motivation to do so. However, there is surprisingly disagreement as to how or whether the industry has already integrated the SDGs or we might think of these as ESGs too. Again, we're kind of using those as synonyms of one another. And this has to do as well with the methodologies of how exactly do you calculate the SDGs or the ESGs for producing financial services and products. So the argument is really about, when we deal with the traditional Islamic contracts which relate to social finance, the zakah, awqaf, sadaqah, qard hasan, these types of specifically socially directed contracts, we know that they've existed for ages. These are ancient transactions, ancient structures for pursuing social objectives. But there is disagreement as to whether, in fact, those types of structures are part and parcel of Islamic finance. That I think is really quite an eye opener, isn't it? Because when one thinks of Islamic finance, Islamic finance is premised on the Sharia, and the Sharia is in itself comprised of economic principles and many others which are meant to give effect to equitable distribution, to just outcomes, which pursue equality to a given extent amongst transacting parties. So that very idea is a kind of strange one, I'll admit. Let's think a little bit more in detail about just why this argument is arising and kind of trying to explain why this has come to the fore. Well, I spoke about differing methodologies. Let's look at the methodology for authorizing Islamic financial products and services versus that of so-called social finance or social cooperatives. First, Islamic finance. Sharia boards in an Islamic financial institution are primarily concerned with the legitimacy of financial instruments and the acceptability of those contracts under Islamic law. This is what we often think of as Sharia compliance. Now, fatwas or fatawa focus on the Sharia audit and compliance, but they're not specifically directed towards the impact or purpose of the funding. And it's true that most applicants for Islamic financial products have a pretty good idea of what Islamic finance is all about, and what is then necessarily acceptable, what types of projects are acceptable, and what are not. And that certainly would include projects related to, say, alcohol production, or the serving of alcohol, or the production of other Islamically forbidden elements, pork raising, pornography, armaments, and so on and so forth. So those are some of the categories that would be filtered out automatically, and applicants would come to an Islamic bank with that awareness. So in practice, the purposes for which funding is used is largely a matter for the applicant beyond those negative screenings. In other words, how they use that money in their businesses, in their project, once it has been agreed, once the transaction has been agreed, that money is then left to the applicant to use for whatever purposes they've sought funding. So let's look at the methodology for social finance in contrast. Now there, the purpose for which funding is utilized is more the central focus of these types of institutions. Now, they're searching basically for a wider impact that benefits society. That is the goal of this institution. It's not merely focused on the companies whose projects are funded. Am I still there? Have I still got you? I notice a shift in the screen. Am I still connected? Okay, it looks like I lost you there for a moment. Shaky connections in this multipolar world. Let me go back to my. So I was focusing on the methodology of social finance. They're focused more on the impact of investments. They're not necessarily focused on how companies or individuals use that money. Let's think of companies, because when we think of finance, we're usually thinking about how companies produce jobs, and this is the real economy that we're aiming at. And that general maxim in the real economy has been one of profit maximization. Social finance is only partly concerned with profit maximization, but more than that, they're focused on the positive externalities and favorable multiplier effects in their extension of credit. Now, this is not an entirely specific focus on the common good, but it certainly is a different conception of the common good compared to Islamic and mainstream commercial banks. So instead of measuring their performance in terms of financial ratios, which is the current practice of Islamic financial institutions, as well as conventional banks, they would measure the impact, the social indicators, whether or not these institutions have met those impact indicators. And we can see that this is commensurate with the SDGs or a similar environmental and social goal type framework. So let me move on. I started out in this talk talking about an identity problem. Well, so there's kind of a lack of conceptual clarity with respect to, as I mentioned, whether or not Islamic finance embodies Islamic social finance, or whether or not, in fact, they're two separate things, strangely. Well, not surprisingly, most academics and practitioners view Islam and its modern developments, such as Islamic finance, as intrinsically social. It's not merely capable of meeting the SDGs, but by definition, it encompasses these goals and possibly extends beyond those goals to deal with more multidimensional ones, spiritual ones, which relate to God and the hereafter. And in fact, there should be no separation in meaning between Islamic finance and Islamic social finance. After all, I said, these principles originate in the Sharia, and as that is inherently a just and ethical framework of commercial law, that in fact these products and services which derive therefrom should embody those principles. Well, on the other hand, there's a kind of what I would call a pragmatic school, and this is a group of practitioners and scholars and lawyers who argue that Islamic finance, while they recognize that Islamic finance should never be separate from Islamic social finance, they argue that it must actively seek to define itself as a form of social finance. It must become more inclusive and a more widely adopted form of finance. It must broaden its global appeal despite the deglobalization of the world. Clearly, I think we've understood from Professor Swalhi and others that finance in many ways is unlikely to deglobalize to such a large extent. That, I think, is something that needs to be discussed. But whether finance remains global in the way that it is today, it is still crucial to the industry, whether that's at a domestic level or a regional level, that it develops its appeal with its own populace, with its own community of possible clients and consumers, in a way that its products are seen as having social impact. Now, the pragmatists believe that this traditional viewpoint is somewhat idealistic, and it adheres to kind of the legalistic adherence to Sharia compliance. And that is this, if you're familiar with Islamic finance, let me just give you a little breakdown of what that means. There's at present a kind of legalistic adherence to the structure of Islamic contracts, which allows them to be halal, which allows them to be permissible, but they, in fact, do not go beyond merely being permissible. And they don't achieve the social objectives for which those very contracts could be used. So we say that this is a legalistic adherence to Sharia as opposed to a substantive structure, a substantive contract which gives effect to social objectives. In practice, we see that very few Islamic financial institutions use the SDGs or pursue those SDG-like goals with the caveat of a few institutions who are taking part in the so-called UN Principles for Responsible Banking. The UN PRI Institute was set up in the aftermath of the global financial crisis and has developed a framework for financial institutions to give effect to the SDRs. And that's, you can find information on that at that website by simply Googling that institute. Now, the pragmatists, of course, believe that Islamic finance has all the tools it needs to get beyond the legalism and to pursue values relevant to sustainability. But to do this, and I notice that my screen is somewhat small there, so I'm going to make that larger. There is a legal solution, and Professor Swali mentioned this as well. I'm going to go into slightly more detail. The legal solution, very interestingly, is also part of the economic solution in this very complex industry on the basis of the Sharia, which undergirds the legal structures used. And this concept that is seen as the solution to expanding to social impact in the industry is the maqasid al-Sharia, the objectives of the Sharia. And this concept obviously is an ancient concept. It was first proposed by, I should mention, the Persian theologian, jurist, and philosopher Al-Ghazali in the 11th century. And he came up with a classification of maqasid on the basis of necessity, darura, and needs, hajiyat, and tahsiniyat, luxuries or embellishments. And these related to the fundamental areas of what was necessary, of those necessities, and that was deen, religion and faith, life, soul, offspring, progeny, intellect, mind, and property and wealth. The honor is, I think, something of a newer addition, but those five are deemed the five necessities. Now, contemporary theorists, of which there have been many, ultimately see these traditional classifications as being somewhat narrow, which is, in my view, a slightly odd analysis. When I look at the traditional classifications, religion, life, offspring, intellect, property, wealth, mal, those are enormously broad, hugely broad, but they are related to necessities. But nonetheless, I see that as a very large framework that could be used. And in fact, previously classical scholars developed that framework, At-Tufi, Ash-Shatibi, to develop intricate methodologies themselves, primarily based on maslaha, on the well-being of the Muslim community, to pursue objectives to modify and adapt Islamic law so that it could deal with the exigencies of life as society advanced, as technology advanced, as new problems arose. Contemporary theorists are ultimately building on this legacy, and they are saying that maqasid needs to be expanded. That's just one interpretation that I'm going to give you. Whether or not that's a valid interpretation is something else. So they say the general maqasid is as provided by Al-Ghazali is one level of that, but it should also include justice. They believe somehow adl is not a part of that. And they also believe that a specific maqasid needs to be conceptualized that can deal with particular topics. I think that seems to be a response to the fact that the generalized maqasid is so broad. How do you use such a broad framework? And the partial maqasid refers then to the specific intents behind the holy sources, the Quran and the Sunnah, or perhaps the consensus of the scholars, the ijma. The basic underlying criticism of the contemporary theorist is that the maqasid was developed by scholars. And in fact, it's not rooted in the holy sources themselves. And their argument is that we need to go back to those holy sources to find the solutions to novel problems and to go beyond the fiqh, go beyond the jurisprudence developed by the scholars, and to not adhere to that jurisprudence in a strict textualist manner, in a literalist manner, if you will, so that we can deal with universal issues that improve, transform, and restore Islamic civilization. And, well, I want to give you an idea of how maqasid as a legal solution, just one little idea, because in fact there are many maqasid-based market developments, but I think one of the most fundamental ones has been previously addressed, and that is the Malaysian Central Bank's value-based intermediation, financing, and investment impact framework. That's a lot of words, but let's call it value-based intermediation to keep it simple. Well, it aims to deliver Sharia outcomes through financial practices that generate positive and sustainable impact to the economy, community, and the environment. And so it is unmistakably oriented in developing financial products and services that are based on the SDGs, but which have a noticeable Sharia element. And Malaysia, being the market leader that it is, has taken it upon itself to create a framework. Now, this is not a law. This is not a legal rule which is implemented in its legal system. And so this represents more of, say, a conceptual framework for developing Islamic finance in that country in a way that achieves positive and sustainable impact to the economy, the community, and the environment, and which is consistent with shareholders' sustainable return and long-term interest, as opposed to short-term, profit-oriented, profit-maximized returns, which financial markets epitomize in the global capitalist economy. And obviously, this value-based intermediation framework aims to incorporate those SDG values and influence Islamic finance as a whole. That is just the few ideas that I wanted to contribute. Thank you for your attention. I look forward to any questions today.
Thank you, Jonathan. It was really brilliant presentation. And at first, Jonathan had a kind of concern about the big capacity of the Islamic finance, which is not, used as is expected. But at first, you talk about some challenges of setting Islamic finance apart from conventional finance, and which can strengthen its value proposition and he referred to some figures that shows about $3 trillion has been founded in Islamic finance. And somewhere else he said that the World Bank and International Monetary Fund, both these two, most important international bodies have accepted the Islamic finance, which has an important role. And he talked about some differences of methodologies between Islamic finance and social finance. And also he talked about the Islamic finance, must actively seek to define itself as a form of social finance. And finally, he talked about microservice as a legal solution for some financial product. Thank you, Jonathan, one more time. And if the attendees have questions, our presenter is ready to answer. Apparently, one of the participants, Mr. Awashiri, has a question. Mr. Awashiri, you can raise your question. As we can see, Mr. Awashiri has raised his hand, but I don't know, he can somehow activate his system microphone to raise the question or not. If you can't, you can type the question.
Yeah.
Okay. Well, thank you. All right. Dr. Johnson, one more time. It was really productive and informative. Thank you. And now let's go. I want you please, be with us till the end of the session, and we go to the last but not least, Dr. Iram Sabo. Dr. Iram Sabo, floor is yours.
Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Assalamu alaikum and welcome to all of you. I hope I am audible.
Good. Assalamu alaikum. Well, good.
Okay. First of all, I am very thankful to the society that you have invited us to talk to you and share our views about this very important topic. By the time we are starting, I would like to request you, brother, if we can start the presentation that I share. And I hope it is there. Yeah. Can you see this?
Yes, it can be seen. Yeah.
Okay. So once again, thank you so much, the Iranian Association of Islamic Finance, and I'm very happy that today I'm going to talk to you. My name is Iram Sabah, as our brother Ali Raza have mentioned, and I am working right now in Pakistan. So talking about the topic that is basically today's webinar's topic is development of Islamic finance markets in a multipolar world. I am very happy to see that my very respected teacher, Dr. Yunus, mentioned about the definition, what is meant by a multipolar world, and then Dr. Jonathan also shared his views related to that. What I am going to talk about for this particular topic is how Islamic finance, ethical finance, SDGs, impact investment, and halal industry brings different dimension in the world. Who is the leader, who is not, who is trying to become leader, what are the pros and cons in all this, then who are the leading countries. Last but not least, I will be focusing on the politics, religion, and Islamic finance. When you talk about Islamic finance, people just believe that this is only related to Islam, whereas Islamic finance take care of all the elements that are ethical, social, justice, equity, fairness, cooperation, empathy, entrepreneurship, and Islamic finance is for both, including Muslims and non-Muslims. So there is no specification that it is only for Muslims. So when you talk about Islamic finance, it is for everybody. And if we talk about different new topics, say for example ESG, even if we talk about the impact investment, Islamic finance inherently have these elements in it. Muslims follow Islamic finance because we seek the happiness of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and we want to please Allah, so we want to follow Sharia compliance, we want to follow the Sharia rules in order to be Sharia compliant, not only in our prayers or ibadah, but also in our economic activities. Then you talk about Islamic financial institutions, then the profit maximization is not the only objective for these institutions. And you see, we give donations and we contribute donations and we take care of the people who are poor. So these are some of the points that are taken care by the Islamic finance industry. Islamic finance is here to stay. So I'm very happy that you have chosen a unique topic that is less debated topic. So Islamic finance is here to stay. You can see Islamic economics, Islamic finance, Islamic banking, Islamic insurance, Islamic REITs, real estate investment trust, Islamic mutual fund, Islamic leasing companies, Sharia compliant stocks, Islamic social finance that includes zakat, charity, endowment work, crowdfunding, and now we have Islamic fintech, Islamic regtech, Islamic subtech. Including all these things, there are certain other topics. For example, less debated topic, governance from Islamic perspective, leadership from Islamic perspective, and also management from Islamic perspective. Now, why I have shared all these points over here? Because in this multipolar world, some countries might be good in management, and knowing and unknowingly, they might be following Sunnah of Holy Prophet, peace be upon him. So they can be excellent in that. What is the status of Islamic finance globally? So as per the research reports, industry reports, the data is till 2021. There are 46 countries having Islamic finance regulation. When you talk about the regulation, it means that the government of that country, the regulatory authorities of that country are active. This is why they have developed and designed the regulations for Islamic finance industry. Now, more than 1,526 Islamic financial institutions approximately are working. The number is higher in reality. So 972 Islamic finance education provider all over the world, 2,566 research articles were written in the past 3 years. There are more than 463 Islamic finance events again in the past 3 years. World Bank, IMF, ADB, IDB, regulatory authorities in different countries working on Islamic finance. Now, with all this, role of academia become very important. Who is going to talk about Islamic ethics, halal industries, so on and so forth. But there are certain problems faced by this particular industry. Whereas this is very, you see, lucrative industry. Why? Because you earn Sharia compliant profit. You earn money in a Sharia compliant manner. But at the same time, we face problems. Now, what are the problems? The first and foremost problem is lack of awareness. Not only in industry, but also in general public, sometimes in the regulatory authority or at the government level, people don't understand what Islamic finance means. So we need to have a trained human resource only in industry, but not only in industry, but also in the academia side. We have lack of innovative products in Islamic finance industry, but some of the countries are coming up with the new innovative products. For example, diminishing musharaka. For example, you see currency salam. Now there are innovations coming in the market. This particular slide is really important. I have taken the data from Islamic Financial Services Board based in Malaysia. This particular slide shows that the top countries having Islamic finance and the percentage of the assets in that particular country. So when you talk about Iran, Iran is at number 1. So Iranian Islamic banking is considered 100% Islamic. Then we have Sudan, then we have Saudi Arabia, Brunei, Kuwait, Malaysia, Qatar. With this, you can see that how who is the hub of Islamic finance, how Islamic finance is growing in different countries. So when you talk about the leading countries for Islamic finance specifically, we might be not a developed country, but at the same time, we are leading Islamic finance. Why? Because we have devised the rules and also we are following those rules. So UAE, Jordan, Palestine, Pakistan even Pakistan is Islamic Republic of Pakistan, but we have only 18% of the total banking industry as Islamic. We have Oman coming forward, Bahrain, Afghanistan, Pakistan, Iraq, Turkey, Maldives, Indonesia, Tunisia, Egypt. So the list goes on. Even a country like Sri Lanka having Islamic banking and finance. South Africa. So this is just to show you, when you talk about Islamic finance, in terms of assets, where Islamic banking assets are present and in what percentage. Now the question comes that out of 190 plus countries all over the world, who is leading Islamic finance? Who is the next hub of Islamic finance? No doubt about it that the Malaysia have done a great job in order to lead Islamic finance. Either it is Islamic capital market, Islamic money market, Islamic social finance, or Islamic banking innovative product. Malaysia is always at the forefront. But how about the other countries? How about Iran? How about Saudi Arabia? How about Pakistan? How about Oman? How about United Kingdom? Because even UK is trying to become the hub of Islamic finance. So before this meeting, I was having another meeting in UK, and they are looking forward how they can bring the investors to UK, Muslim investors, or they can issue social sukuk so that investors from all over the world can invest in that. Turkey, Sudan, or any other nation, or East or West. So you can ask the question that in this world, who is leading Islamic finance? Is it East, or this is the idea of East but is led by the West? Why? Because they are more heard. Now, not only this, I want to link who is leading this Islamic finance with the SDGs, now Sustainable Development Goals. When we talk about Islamic finance, and if we say that East is leading Islamic finance, or GCC, or you see Muslim countries or OIC countries. So what happened is, why there is a need for SDGs? Because inherently Islamic finance have a value proposition in it. There is a value in Islamic finance. This is why the industry is $3 trillion industry, right? But when you talk about SDGs, all the countries in the world are focusing on the achievement of SDGs, how to protect the world. Now, annually, I'm saying the need for meeting the SDGs is basically $3 to $4 trillion till 2030. Now, imagine why the world is working on SDGs, because they see the value proposition, but somehow, unfortunately, the value of Islamic finance is not properly shared or disclosed with the West as well. Opportunity for Islamic financial institution in this regard. Why don't they share about what are the value propositions that are already taken care? Say, for example, SDG 1, SDG 2, even for poverty, for education, for health, all these things are present in Islamic finance. So there is a, lack of information. Now, again, moving towards the Islamic finance and leading the way for SDGs. The SDGs are universal call to action to end poverty. Why not? We can say Islamic finance is basically an international call, a universal call. Now, I have mentioned earlier about the gap, the financing gap. Islamic finance needs to emphasize on inclusiveness and the broader understanding of business-society relationship. If we start working on this one, then I believe that we can take Islamic finance to a higher level, and it can contribute to the well-being of the society. Islamic finance and again SDGs, they have very close connection. Rather, I would say that SDGs falls under Islamic finance. The Maqasid al-Sharia, Dr. Jonathan mentioned about that. That is perfectly correct, that Maqasid al-Sharia, that is objective of Sharia in Islamic finance, all are taken care in a sense that SDGs are part of it. So if you talk about how we can help the achieve SDGs, we can bring Mudaraba, Musharka, Salam, Istasna, diminishing Musharka, and so on and more Islamic financing modes. Malaysia and Indonesia are leading by the examples of Green Sukuk. We need to bring it on the paper for the international market. Islamic finance has huge potential, but we need to share it with the world, different countries, that what we can do for the not only our own country, but also for the world overall. These are some of the points that I wanted to discuss with all the participants, and I want to share it with all of you because it is very important. When you talk about Islamic finance, it is growing $3 trillion industry, that's fine. Have value, inherent value of Maqasid al-Sharia, and also the SDGs, ESG, impact investment, all these things, value-based investment, they all are part of Islamic finance. But when you talk about how Islamic finance will be in the future, you need to think about developing countries, underdeveloped countries, and developed countries. Then Muslim versus non-Muslim countries, rich versus poor nations, role of multilateral standard setting bodies, inclination of investors, powerful versus weak states in the world, who dictates the economy in the world. Now, who rules the economy of the world? Impact of Islamic finance. So far, we haven't shared with the world that, you see, this is the impact of Islamic finance on our economy. So we need to show the evidence. Domestic versus international pressure, Sharia scholars versus banker industry professionals, autonomous regulatory authorities. Do we have that in order to practice Islamic finance? Another debate, last but not least, Arab versus non-Arab. So these are some of the points when you talk about the power in the country, in the world actually, how it moves, who is taking care of this Islamic finance industry. We need to keep these things in mind. Now, when we talk about the status of Islamic finance in future, what are the important items or skills or the topics that we need to take care? We need to focus basically on the sense making. We need to show to people that Islamic finance does make sense. It is of importance. We need to utilize the social intelligence. We need to be adaptive thinker. We need to take care of the cross cultures when you talk about Islamic finance or Islamic banking. We need to be computationally competent. We need to utilize the computer systems, you see different programs, apps, so on and so forth. And another important point in this world is basically the new media literacy. The media is not the same as it used to be in our time. The media is changing rapidly. People are just believing on social media. So we need to strategize when you talk about Islamic finance. We need to have more collaboration. I'm so happy that we are having this webinar, because this webinar shows, despite I am sitting in Pakistan and Dr. Yunus is sitting in Malaysia, you all are in Iran, and Dr. Jonathan, if I'm not wrong, he's from UK. So how we are collaborating in order to learn from each other. The mindset, the design mindset we need to be focused on the results, and we need to have cognitive load management, how we are going to comprehend when you talk about Islamic banking and finance. Islamic finance is our religious duty. Yes, it is. Being Muslim, it is our religious duty, and we need to create awareness for that. We cannot have a balance unless we bring the other parties on board and we all move in the same direction for the betterment of the society. We should promote Islamic social finance. This is month of Ramadan, and you know that Muslims, they give the maximum charity all over the world. Collaboration among international and local partners, Islamic finance to promote ethical finance values and value propositions. Fintech should be utilized, need to work with the non-Muslim states and Muslim states together. Multilateral standard setting bodies have to play an important role, and specifically IDB, ADB, IOF, International Islamic Financial Market, IILM, CIIF, IMF, World Bank, also regulatory authorities and governments of the countries. With this, I would like to conclude my presentation. Brother Ali Raza requested me to, complete the presentation, so I hope I am on time.
Right, thank you, Dr. Yoram Sabu. It was a very comprehensive presentation about Islamic finance. And Dr. Sabu at first talked about why Islamic finance is attractive, and she mentioned some reasons such as ethical, social pact, equity, fairness, and cooperation with Islamic finance. And then she talked about some subcategories of Islamic finance, which are Islamic economics, Islamic banking, Islamic insurance, takaful, mutual funds, and so on. And somewhere else, she looked at the Islamic finance globally, and she mentioned that there are 46 countries around the world with Islamic finance regulations, and also there are 1,526 Islamic financial institutions in 4 corners of the world. And somewhere else she talked about the future of Islamic finance and which countries will be the next hub of Islamic finance. And according to her presentation, Malaysia, Iran, Kazakhstan, Pakistan, Oman, the UK, and will be some of the hub of Islamic finance in the future. And then she talked about Islamic finance, important aspect can help to achieve the sustainable development goals by using Murahaba, Musharaka, and other Islamic bonds. And finally, she touched upon the future skills which are important for Islamic banking. Thank you, and one more time, I want to thank for all attendees, and particularly our presenters. And if the attendees have any questions at the end of the session that we are in right now, our dear presenters are ready to answer. Otherwise, if our presenters want to say something at the last point, we are all yes. Okay, thank you, Dr. Jonathan Erkan-Bragg and Professor Dr. Yunus Swalhi, and also Dr. Iram Sabur. And we really enjoyed listening to your presentations today, and we could learn some different points regarding Islamic finance through different aspects. You did very well. And if we wanted to somehow conclude today's specialized meeting, and which was on development of Islamic finance markets in a multipolar world. And at first, Dr. Swalhi defines multipolar world, and according to his definition, in multipolar world, each country's legitimate interests are respected, and he touched about somehow about reforms of IMF governance to increase the quota allotted to the countries, and also the challenges of this one. And then Dr. Jonathan Erkan-Bragg talked about some challenges which are in Islamic finance, and he mentioned different points, and he somehow tried to distinguish between the differences of methodologies between Islamic finance and social finance. And finally, Dr. Sabul talked about some attractive points of Islamic finance, and he mentioned some figures regarding Islamic financing globally and the future of Islamic finance. Thank you, very nice. And now I can see there is a question. One of the attendees asked the question. Thank you for, no, just he appreciated. I thought it was a question. Well, thank you. Any questions? And if you want to say something at the end of the session, we are all ears. You 3 respected presenters.
I would like to say one thing, that I enjoyed, this virtual presentation, because coming to Iran is always a dream. So virtually, I was in Iran today, so I personally liked it very much. And it was a pleasure to listen to Dr. Jonathan and my very dear Professor Dr. Yunus Swalhi as well. So it was amazing. Thank you so much, Brother Ali Raza.
You're welcome. Good. I hope with the eradication of coronavirus, COVID-19, we will see each other in close in Iran.
Yes, thank you very much.
You're welcome.
And, from my part, I would like to congratulate the organizers of this very unique forum, addressing a very important topic. And I have really enjoyed the both presentations of Mr. Jonathan and Dr. Emo. And hopefully we can we can meet in other forums, inshallah.
All right, good. Very well. Thank you. Take care. Bye now.
Thank you. Goodbye.
Bye. Thanks.
All right.
Assalamu alaikum.
Bye. Bye.